Welcome to Micro-Digressions. This is Spencer Case, your host as always, and this is the introduction to part 2 of the 2024 Rant-a-thon. I sure hope that you enjoy listening to it a lot more than I enjoyed editing it. No end of technical difficulties this time. I don't know what the deal was, but no matter. Let me tell you what I've got lined up for you this time. So first up, we've got Matt Lutz, and he has a rant about a priori knowledge, followed by a rant about the politicization of the university and how foolish this is for progressives for purely practical reasons. And then we have a little bit of an addendum to or a coda, I guess, to our discussion about the Joe Biden presidency from a few months ago. After that, I have got a rant from Travis Timmerman on the movie Megalopolis, this Francis Ford Coppola catastrophe, critics are calling it, and Timmerman's many critiques of that film. And then I have my own rant on the Luigi Mangione fan club that has emerged online. I should say there is one little error. I sometimes say United Health rather than United Healthcare, so I'm just mentioning that errata now, getting that out of the way. When I say United Health, I mean United Healthcare. That's the name of the company that Brian Thompson was CEO of. Okay, and then finally, we have our token lefty, Ben Burgis, making the case that heterodox liberals are hypocritical and inconsistent on their views on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Okay, he says a lot of things there I disagreed with, but I didn't engage with him very much, partly because, we could go back and forth for 3 hours, but we're also planning on doing a podcast on this together in a few months, or maybe as short as soon as a few months. So stay tuned for those collaborations. All right, without further ado, I give you Matt Lutz. Matt Lutz, welcome back to the podcast. I don't know if you saw where our book is on Amazon today on the rankings.
No, I don't check it every day. Every other day, but not today.
Okay, I haven't checked it for a while, but today in philosophy, it was like 324.
Cool.
So I understand you've got 2 rants, a nerdy rant and then a political rant?
Yeah, a nerdy rant and a political rant. So both relatively short. Let's do the nerdy rant first. So my nerdy rant is about a priori knowledge. And this is a really difficult topic in philosophy. Basically, the question is, how can we know things about the world just by thinking about it, right? So like there's a world that exists independently of us and independently of our minds. And a priori knowledge is supposed to be knowledge of the world that exists independently of us that we can have simply by thinking. And it's really, really weird that anything like that could be possible. How can we have knowledge of the world just by thinking? I mean, when it comes to a posteriori knowledge, empirical knowledge by perception, it's pretty clear approximately how we can have knowledge of the world through empirical perception, right? We've got these eyes, ears, nose, these sense faculties, which then put us in a kind of causal contact to the world. That we receive information from the world through our sense organs, and that gives us knowledge of how things are in the world. Of course, there's plenty of complications that get involved in that story, but it's clear roughly how something like that is supposed to work. But in the a priori knowledge case, there's nothing even approximately sensible to say about how that could be possible. How can you sit back in your armchair, close your eyes, and think, and then come to understand the way the world is, right? How does the act of thought put us in contact with the world itself? And there's not a good answer to that question. This is a very old question in philosophy. And despite thousands of years of thought about this question, we don't really have a good answer. So, like, Plato thought that the answer was that before we were born, our souls were put into direct sort of causal contact with the forms. And then when we were born, when our souls were embodied, part of that process involved taking a bath in the river of forgetfulness, forgetting the forms that we had learned about before our souls were embodied. And then during our lives, remembering what our souls learned before we forgot when we became embodied. Now that's insane. That is an insane account of how we can have a priori knowledge. But we don't really have a better account. After Plato, for from Plotinus on to the early modern period, there are all these sort of religious ideas about a priori knowledge. God was supposed to be telling us one way or the other. But if you're secular, what is a secular account of a priori knowledge? We still don't really have one. There are empiricist accounts of a priori knowledge, which says that a priori knowledge isn't really knowledge of the world. It's knowledge of our own concepts, knowledge of our own mental states. Somehow when we're thinking, we're just figuring out the structure of our ideas. We're figuring out the structure of our concepts. But that doesn't really teach us anything about the world, except in maybe an extremely kind of indirect sort of way. Now, I think that sort of empiricist view that says that all a priori knowledge is this kind of conceptual knowledge, I think that that's correct. This is a minority view among philosophers. And I think it's just incumbent on philosophers who reject that sort of conceptual account of a priori knowledge to come up with an account of how we can have a priori knowledge. This is like a prerequisite to doing any philosophy at all, is to figure out how philosophy is possible. Because, of course, philosophy is supposed to be a priori knowledge. This is what philosophers are supposed to do. They're supposed to figure out things about the world by just closing their eyes and sitting in their armchair and musing and thereby coming to know. But if you ask most philosophers how that's possible, you're going to get like a shrug. They'll go, I don't know how that's possible. That's a really hard question. Not a question that I work on, though. I don't know how that could be a question that philosophers don't work on. Like you got to have some idea in your pocket for how that's possible, for how a priori knowledge is possible, because that's got to inform just like your self-conception as a thinker. What are you even doing when you're doing philosophy? Why think that the task that you're engaged in is the kind of task that could be successful? It's a bit of a scandal that philosophers, although they take this question seriously, this is not always the first question that they ask, but it should be. Because I don't know how you do philosophy. So that's my nerdy rant.
Okay, why do I have to know how philosophy is possible in order to do philosophy? Like, I think you would agree that lots of scientists don't know the deep mechanics about how science works or the epistemology of scientific theorizing, and yet they can do science. So why can't philosophy be like that?
Well, I mean, so there's different sort of like levels of detail and layers of knowledge that we can have there, right? Like scientists, there is controversy among difficult questions in the philosophy of science, of course, but if you ask, an astrophysicist how they know about stars and planets, they'll be like, I see them through a telescope, right? And then there's a pretty straightforward story about how that's supposed to work, right? There's the light; it comes from the stars, and it is captured by the telescope in various sorts of ways, and I can describe roughly how it's built,
and then, how it becomes knowledge in our minds, and how we overcome skepticism, and like he's not going to have a story about all that stuff.
Well, I mean, those are different questions. Those are epistemic questions about just like the nature of knowledge, and those are like difficult philosophical questions. But in terms of just the basic mechanism, right, whereby there are facts about the world, and our thought can be put in contact with those facts, Like, that's not too difficult a question to answer if you're a scientist, but it's an extraordinarily difficult question to answer if you're a philosopher.
It's because we're asking harder questions. In any event, I'm having the reaction of not being scandalized. I'm like, you're right. This is a hard question. I don't have the answer to this. You're right. We should be looking for it. But that's just that's the way it is with other philosophical questions. I don't think the fact that it's presupposed in philosophy makes it any different.
So here, I guess I just need to appeal to the intuitions of your listeners. This feels scandalous to me. And if when I was giving my little rant before, you had a doubt, well, surely philosophers must care about this a lot. I present to you a case study, Spencer, the case of Spencer, who isn't really scandalized by this, who doesn't really consider this to be a fundamentally important topic, who doesn't feel like they need to address this before they do any other philosophy. So Spencer's attitude is extremely widespread, and I think that's a little bit nuts.
Okay, I'm interested. It's fundamental the way a million other things are fundamental. But you can have a final word on that.
I think it just speaks to methodology, right? Maybe put it that way, right? Like, what's a good way of thinking and what's a bad way of thinking? What's a way of thinking that's going to get us to good answers? What's a bad way of thinking that's going to get us the answers? We rely on intuitions. Which intuitions do we rely on? What makes them good or bad? Like fundamentally, like how to resolve philosophical questions is going to turn on the answers to this question about how a priori knowledge is possible. And so I don't see how you can have a philosophical methodology in the absence of at least a vague idea of how a priori knowledge is possible.
In fairness, I have, after the book, been looking more deeply into this issue. In particular, I'm looking into what exactly is it we mean by analytic or conceptual truth, because I find that the accounts I've heard of this are unsatisfactory as well.
Yep, there's a very interesting literature on that. I wish more people were familiar with it.
All right, then. Let's hear your political rant.
All right. My political rant, this is one that you've heard from me before, and one that I've written about before, but I feel a need to say it again and again because it's really important. And this is that academia is facing a big problem in the near future. And the origin of that problem is that academia is increasingly politically focused, and in particular, focused around left-wing political projects. But academia is only able to function because we get funding, often from the government. And the government is controlled at many levels by conservatives. After the recent election, we have the Republican Party controlling all branches of government. And if the point of academia is to attack conservative politics, then conservative politicians are not going to fund academia. That's just obvious. There has been a long tradition of conservative politicians funding academia out of just some inertia, a holdover from a time when academia was much less partisan than it is right now. But as academia's political orientation and self-conception and conception in the popular political imagination has changed, then that is going to create very different political incentives for conservative politicians. When I've run this argument past people who are more conservatively inclined, the most common response that I've gotten is to say, yeah, that's a good point. I don't know why we do fund academia. We really should be cutting their funding, right? And this isn't like me convincing conservatives things that they haven't thought of before. This is me putting words to an incoherent feeling that they already had and were already acting on. Donald Trump's plans for the Department of Education are extraordinarily hostile to higher education. We'll see how that plays out. But to a certain extent, this is a pain that progressive academia is bringing on itself. I don't think that this is a good thing. I don't think that conservative governments should be using their power to undercut academia. I think that the plans that Trump is likely to have are hostile to academic freedom, and I am a huge supporter of academic freedom. So at a moral level, I am strongly opposed to all of these goings on. But at a practical level, what the fuck else do you expect, right? You know, you're sticking your jaw out and saying, hit me, hit me, hit me, hit me, hit me, hit me, hit me. You're going to get hit really hard. And so we need to realize as an academic community that that's coming. And in responding to that, our response can't simply be resistance. It needs to recognize that there's a fundamental incoherence in the political posturing of contemporary academia. And we need to tone that down a little bit, at least, or else we're just going to get hit again and again and again. The beatings will continue until morale improves.
I guess I do want you to say a bit more about why you would be morally opposed to like a conservative backlash against higher education. If indeed it is true that it's been captured by one side of the political spectrum, why shouldn't the other side treat it as an institution that's been captured, right? What would be wrong with that way of reasoning?
Well, I mean, I value academic freedom. I think a correction needs to happen, but I think that the way that the correction needs to happen is sort of internally to the institution, right? What I'm hoping for is for people to listen to your podcast and to hear the wisdom in what I'm saying and to correct, right? Like what I'm doing now is I'm trying to give an argument which will lead to change. That is the way that change should happen within academia. It should happen through the force of reason. Both maybe about appreciating like what conservatives can offer intellectually to academia. But if you can't believe that conservatives can offer anything intellectually to academia, then at least think realistically about what the practicalities of it are. Right? I'm trying to offer an argument here, whereas what the conservative politicians are doing is they're just offering pure force, a cudgel. Right? They're going to try to beat academia into line. And I'm a persuasion guy. I'm not a cudgel guy. So that's why I'm taking the line that I am. Although to your point, yeah, like this is what conservative politicians are going to do, right? Politicians aren't particularly committed to academic freedom. I wish they were, but they're not, right? They're going to do what they're going to do. And progressive academia has enjoyed a remarkable amount of forbearance in the past. And we are seeing the end of that forbearance.
I just want to push you a little bit more on that point. Are you a cudgel guy when reason fails? Because institutions often do not reform themselves in response to arguments.
I mean, I think that's just a really hard question. One of my little political mottos, not just political, but in life, is that the existence of a problem doesn't imply the existence of a solution. I regard force to be unacceptable, and if that means that there's no way to change things, then there's no way to change things, and that sucks. I hope that the force of persuasion can be effective, right? I argue vigorously for the vision of the good life that I find most appealing. But yeah, if that doesn't work, then I don't know. Life sucks sometimes.
I'm wondering if I could ask you to say a bit about your assessment of the Biden administration in light of the way the last few months have gone. And I hope this doesn't seem like I'm taking a cheap shot, although maybe I am. But
yeah, I mean, so this is a callback to our earlier podcast where we debated the Biden presidency, and that we had that conversation right after he dropped out of the race. And my overall assessment of Biden has not really particularly changed. I think that the country was overall run quite well under his administration. That's not to say that he was perfect. But on the things that I care about the most, mostly about the economy and some elements of foreign policy, I think he was very good. Now, I know that people will, dislike what Biden has done on those fronts, but go back to our earlier conversation. I'll defend that in greater detail. The areas where my opinion has moved somewhat over the last couple months is so. For one thing, I'm much more frustrated with Biden for not having dropped out substantially earlier. I think that I'm appalled that Trump is re-entering office. I think it was very easy for him to beat Harris, who was an exceptionally weak candidate. And I think that we ended up with Harris as a candidate because there was a scramble at the last second because Biden didn't drop out substantially earlier when he should have. I mean, arguably, he shouldn't have even run in the first place. Should have opened up Pete Buttigieg or Amy Klobuchar to be the moderate candidate in 2020. I continue to think that Amy Klobuchar is the most underrated politician that the Democrats have. Like, Biden just could not get out of the Democrats' way, an act of immense hubris. So personally, I hold that against him. I think the Hunter Biden pardon is indefensible. Maybe a minor thing in the larger scale of things, but it speaks to character and not in a good way. Maybe we can fold that into a similar sort of criticism around ego. There's a report out in the Wall Street Journal just this last week saying that Biden had been notably senile for years, and now that Biden's on his way out, the people who are close to him are feeling more free to admit that. I think that's horrendous. I think that's a horrific scandal. I think that every person around Joe Biden who enabled that, both as his aides, high-level assistants, and in the media, people who were in a position to know but didn't say anything, have done something extremely bad, completely indefensible. I said earlier when I was talking about my impression of Biden that I think that the country was run well under Biden or something like that. I particularly avoided saying that Biden ran the country well because at this point, I don't think that we can conclusively say that that was the case, which is deeply concerning.
I was just having the thought that suppose Biden had lost in 2020 and Trump had won as he claims to have won in 2020. Imagine where we would be now. Trump would be leaving. January 6th would have never happened. The Democrats might have been put on an accelerated path to sobering up, and we would be moving into a post-Trump era. And just doesn't that seem better than where we're at now?
Yeah. I mean, maybe January 6th was bad. Not having that in the timeline would have been better. The timeline you're describing, we are now at the end of Trump, whereas now we're halfway through Trump. I'm not looking to another 4 years of Trump, but like Trump would have run the country extremely poorly for the last 4 years, the way that he's going to be running the country extremely poorly for the next 4 years. So hard to evaluate the counterfactual. I think that there's a lot that Biden did in terms of helping the economy recover from COVID, which he still doesn't get nearly enough credit for. Or maybe Biden didn't do it, but someone in the White House did. That were extremely good at helping the economy recover from COVID, and I don't think Trump would have been nearly as effective.
All right, we'll leave it at that. 3 first. So thank you, Matt, for all 3 of your rants.
Well, it was 2 rants, and then I answered a question, so 2.5.
All right, Travis Timmerman, I understand we're going to do a couple of rants together, and your first one is about a movie. So go ahead and tell us what that's all about.
Sure. So the first one is not about something that's important, but it is something that I want to rant about because it's about the worst film that I saw in theaters this year. and that is Megalopolis, the latest film by the living legend Francis Ford Coppola. And just to be clear, he is a phenomenal filmmaker, one of the best ever, not just American filmmakers, but in the world. He's written, directed, or produced a string of masterpieces, which include the Godfather series, perhaps most notably, but also Patton, The Conversation, Dracula, The Rainmaker, and produced Paul Schrader's Mishima, and there's a whole bunch of others that are part of his filmography, which are worth seeing. And if you haven't seen those films or heard of them, it's worth noting how eclectic that background is in every sense. Like the genre of film is different. The shots, the camera angles, the color palette, the writing style, including the narrative structure of films. He does a lot of experimental stuff, and he's done straightforward stuff. The mise en scène, the direction that he gives the actors, the budget, very tiny, minimal budgets to huge, large-scale mega projects. The demographics that they're targeting, I mean, really impressive resume and very different. And it's extremely difficult to make one masterful film in one style. But to make multiple masterpieces that are very different from one another really does take a special kind of versatile genius. So he is a phenomenal filmmaker, and this has been his passion project, Megalopolis, for decades. And it is a flaming pile of garbage. It is absolutely terrible in almost every respect, with a few flashes of genius in there, but by and large, it's complete garbage. And to understand how disappointing it is to see, we have to know a little bit about the production. So I'm going to talk about the production, give a summary of the film for people who haven't seen it, which I assume is most people, and then a few things about why it's so utterly terrible. Okay. So he's been thinking about this since at least 1977, when he was filming Apocalypse Now, based on Heart of Darkness. Seemed like he was reading Ayn Rand at the same time as well when he started working on this project. And he tried to get this made 4 decades with many false starts. In the early 80s, he produced 400 pages of script and notes, which is, that's multiple movie scripts, just in terms of length. He tried to film it in 1989, but then he ended up making The Godfather 3 instead. Then he used his own production company to try to get funding to film it in the early 90s, but then put it off to make other films that were more commercially viable, I think, to get out of debt. He couldn't get any production company to agree to fund the picture, probably because they knew it was a piece of garbage that would not be profitable. But in 2001, he seemed like he was making progress, and he got all the way to a table read, which is he had a complete narrowed down script. He had actors sitting around and reading the script. But then September 11th happened, and the film Megalopolis takes place in New York, and there's an event in the film that mirrors sort of what happens in 9/11, so he shelved it. A year later, he shot over 60 hours of second unit footage, like exterior shots from New York and stuff, and had decided to self-finance the project. But that got shelved for some reason. Then he gets started again in 2019. And the way that he eventually got this made was he has a very profitable wine company, and he borrowed against his business in the wine company. He took out $120 million of his own money to finance this project, which is a huge budget for a film. That's like a major studio picture level budget for a movie. And then he couldn't get anybody to distribute it after it was made, so he paid Lionsgate, a film company, like a medium-sized one, a bunch of money to distribute the film and guaranteed them a profit if they did the theatrical release and the advertising for them, again, out of his own money. So I don't know exactly how much of his own money that he spent, but it was at least 120 million, probably much more than that, probably closer to 150 million. It was delayed by COVID when he had started to shoot it. So he ended up shooting it in late 2022, wrapped filming 2023, and it came out this year. Okay. That's going to be relevant to understanding how egotistical the story is. So this is a film that defies summary, and it defies summary because has so many characters. Many of them are superfluous. There's a lot of weird things that are going on and threads that are started that are just not followed through. But here is my best attempt at a relatively short synopsis of the film. Adam Driver plays a character named Caesar Catalina, who lives in a reimagined New York / ancient Roman city. And he's portrayed as a sort of unparalleled genius artist who's primarily an architect. Although you don't see him doing a lot of architecture, he likes to spend his time waxing poetic about what he thinks of as big ideas, and by extension, what Coppola thinks of as big ideas. They're really just broad themes like progress and the future and people holding genius artists back from making the world better. And he just sort of speaks in quasi-poetic aphorisms, sometimes directly at the camera. At one point, he just recites some Shakespeare. Okay, so Caesar wins a Nobel Prize in the film for inventing a magical material that he calls megalon, which is a building material that he wants to rebuild New Rome with. And that's, just as an aside, the tackiest on-the-nose name given to anything in film since James Cameron's Avatar, where he had his characters go after what he called unobtainium, which was a rare compound that was also going to produce something good. It's just unbelievable. What a stupid name that is for that. Anyway, getting back to Caesar, he also, for some reason, secretly has the ability to stop time. The reason in the film is because Megalon is magic, and he used his deceased wife's hair and, I think, heart to make this material. And that gives him the powers to stop time for some reason. I don't know why he tried to build in this scientific-ish explanation, but that's what I could glean from the film. Why, though, Coppola thought he should give Caesar the power to stop time remains a mystery to me, because he never really uses it to move the plot along in any important way. He just sort of pauses it to deliver monologues, not to actually make the world better. Okay, so he lives in New Rome. They have modern technology, but they sort of dress in the way that somebody that saw a lot of old TV shows that portrayed Rome might think ancient Romans dress. The way they speak is a sort of mix of modern English and what Coppola thinks of as, I think, English translations of ancient Roman dialect. And the Caesar wants to use his megalon, his little magical building invention, to improve New Rome with his architectural brilliance, but people keep getting in the way. Most notably, the corrupt mayor Cicero, who also, for some reason, prosecuted Caesar for the murder of his deceased wife, even though he knew that she committed suicide. And that creates a series of threads that aren't always concluded. And so the mayor and these other obstructionists make Caesar a sad alcoholic and prevent him from getting what he wants initially. Then he falls in love with Caesar's daughter. Caesar falls in love with Cicero's daughter, that mayor. Though it's completely unclear why they even like each other or what they see in each other. She's not ambitious like him. She's not a well-developed character. She loathes him at first, but he stops time and she's not affected by that. And that seems to create some sort of attraction between them. Then he loses the ability to stop time, but regains it in her presence because of their love, I suppose. And as you can guess from this, lots of other random stuff happens. Caesar's friends with benefits, marries his wealthy, corrupt uncle, a virginal singer who raises money to keep her virginity until she's married, is shown fornicating with Caesar in a leaked video. Shia LaBeouf is in the movie for some reason, and he's cross-dressing for some unexplained reason. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but they just don't really explain why his character is suddenly cross-dressing for much of the film. And they mention something about a fraternity-like pledge, but that's it. Just a bunch of weird, random stuff happens in the movie that is not integral to the plot, until, out of the blue, a Soviet satellite crashes into New Rome and destroys a great deal of it. That's the event that's sort of like 9/11. But Caesar, being the altruistic genius that he is, begins to rebuild Megalopolis with Megalon, financing the project with his own family fortune, because everyone else was standing in his way. So Caesar takes his own money to take Megalon to rebuild the city. Much like, you might think, Coppola took his own money to make this great film in his mind that nobody else would let him make for decades. But as Caesar is selflessly rebuilding the city with his magic material, Shia LaBeouf's character riles up the citizens to point to the difference between Caesar's wealth and their poverty after the destruction of the city. And then he becomes a populist politician and sort of becomes a Trump-like dictator. This results in Caesar being assassinated. In my favorite part of the film, a young child asks Caesar for an autograph. Caesar's giving it to him because he's just perfect in every way, apparently, and then gets shot point blank in the face. And I thought, oh, mercifully, this film might end now. He's dead. I can go home. But no, actually, for some unexplained reason, the doctors can bring Caesar back to life using his magical megalon material. They rebuild his skull and presumably parts of his brain, and then he's okay. So he's effectively immortal as a result of this material that he created and financed himself. Okay, so after this, Caesar and the corrupt mayor Cicero become allies. Well, actually, after Shia LaBeouf's character, Pulcher, who's now a Trump-like dictator, gets his supporters to storm the Megalopolis city hall in a way that's reminiscent of January 6th. Then Caesar and Cicero become allies. Caesar confronts the rioters, and he gives a rousing, moving speech, and all of a sudden quells the angry mob, and they're all on his side. And then they turn around and they murder Shia LaBeouf's character, Pulcher, in my second favorite part of the film. So what this is Caesar's artistic genius has transcended politics, and he's healed a divided nation with his artistic speeches. And all of the detractors are suddenly on his side. He has a daughter who's named Sunny Hope. I'm surprised Coppola didn't name children or our future. And then his wife, who's the mayor's daughter, is shown to be pregnant with another child who's alluded to as being like the next Messiah, whose name is Francis. And I want to remind your audience that the director of this film is named Francis Ford Coppola. Okay, so that's the short summary, and I left an enormous amount of weird, utterly bizarre stuff out. Why do I want to rant about this? Well, let me just say some things about why this just sucks, even though it should be much of it's completely transparent from what I just said. One reason it was so disappointing is Coppola spent so much time on this, and it's just terrible. It's bizarre, campy, laughable, egoistic mess. It's sometimes beautifully shot, and sometimes you can see like the potential flashes of genius that Coppola still has, but it's completely drowned out by everything about it that doesn't work. And that's just magnified from the fact that he's one of the best filmmakers ever. And you can compare it to his earlier work. If this were just like Tommy Wiseau, who directed The Room, put this together, I would think, it's not bad, Tommy. It's better than The Room. You're making progress. But the trajectory of his film started up here, and then it's just gone down, and that makes it extra disappointing. And he could have done better. This is just the result of an egomaniac. He could have done better. He could have listened to producers who refused to finance the film. He could have brought in script doctors to read the script and give him notes on it. He could have asked his friends to give him reliable advice about why this is trash. He could have asked the actors on set what they thought, many of which were unhappy with it. He could have put this up to focus groups. He could have done a series of things to have steered the course in a better direction, but he chose not to. It's hard to overstate the difference between how good his other films were and how bad this was. It's like if David Chalmers decided to self-publish his next book, and his next book was Jordan Peterson's We Who Wrestle with God. Right? It's like if Paul McCartney left the Beatles to do a solo album, and then what he produced was Rebecca Black's Friday, right? Like, that's how bad it is. The film is full of plot holes. Major plot elements are not explained. New things are introduced without explanation, like Megalon can heal skulls and brains all of a sudden. Many characters are introduced, and they don't have character arcs, and they're completely superfluous to the story. The names, I would be remiss. I'd already complained to you about this, Spencer, but the names. Aubrey Plaza's character is a jealous, shallow television personality who wants money and fame, and she's named Wow Platinum. That's the name that he chose. Caesar's child is named Sunny Hope. And I had said this to you before. It's so on the nose. It's like a fifth grader wrote it after learning about symbolism from the first time from a Fast and Furious film. It's like if Coppola named Michael Corleone Gangster Face Badman. The virginal singer is named Besta Sweetwater. The Messiah child is named Francis after himself. And then the historical characters that it's based on, Cicero and Crassus, are just named after those characters. So everything is so like on the nose. There's nothing that's left to the reader, to the viewer's sort of imagination to figure out. One thing that's terrible about it is the bad philosophical views. It's like he read a Reddit thread of Ayn Rand and regurgitated it into the script. That's extremely annoying to me as a philosopher. It's extremely egotistical, as I mentioned, and that really, really annoyed me. And the visual effects were terrible because he fired his crew halfway through and got another one in, and they used a different means of filming. So sometimes it looks pretty and sometimes it looks really cheap. I will stop there. I could go on for hours about how terrible this film is, but I've gone over my time, so I'll stop.
Okay, so is there any possibility in a decade or two someone's gonna go back and rewatch this and think, oh, actually it was brilliant. We were missing it. It actually is great. You know, after all, it's Coppola, so maybe maybe the problem is the audience. What do you think?
Yes, I think that is a possibility, but it'll be unwarranted. The reason that I think it's a possibility is because he is, or at least was, an artistic genius. And when you have a film that is as self-contradictory and bizarrely staged and completely open to interpretation, that makes it very easy for somebody to pick out one of the literally infinite number of coherent interpretations that you could give, some of which will make more sense than others, and then fill in an explanation about what he was doing that actually has artistic merit. But that many of those explanations, I think, just aren't going to track what was actually happening. But because it's not like a mathematical proof or philosophical argument, there's so many ways to approach understanding what's going on in a film that you can always come up with some explanation that makes it sound like it has artistic merit. And because of his reputation, his deserved reputation, I'm sure that'll happen. And there's already been people that have said it's a brilliant.
So last question on this. You said this is not a serious topic, but maybe there is something serious here. So like with The Godfather, famously, I'm sure you know something about the filming of that movie. That was done with all sorts of constraints, and he was fighting the studio, and he had to work with the author of the book for the adaptation, and there were all of these things, all these constraints. So maybe there's a lesson here about, no matter how brilliant you are, you need some kind of constraint. You need some kind of feedback mechanism to be at your best. And no one is really so brilliant as to transcend that. Maybe that's the lesson of this.
Yeah. So I actually worry that people will take that as a lesson. We'll get fewer big swings from artists who actually could do something not entirely by themselves, but as independently as Coppola did this film. So there's been many people that have self-financed projects that have turned out things that are actually quite good. So Sylvester Stallone's Rocky, he refused to sell it to a studio and have somebody else be cast in that role. And he had a unique vision that he wanted to realize, and he made it on the cheap for that and made a film that was much better than if he allowed the studio to interfere. Woody Allen, as I had mentioned, made a number of classics where he insisted that he had final cut and like no interference from the studio. He basically wants money in a brown bag to realize his vision. And that's turned out garbage, but it's also made Annie Hall. It's made a string of films in the 80s with Mia Farrow that are brilliant, including The Purple Rose of Cairo, I think is underappreciated. It made Crimes and Misdemeanors. It made Match Point. I mean, there's just people who can do this. Now, nobody works completely alone. Any good director is going to take input from actors and from fellow writers about script and have an editor helping them in the editing room. But there's many cases where they can listen to this input and they have the final say, and they exercise their creative control, often disagreeing with those around them, and they produce something that's truly magnificent. And this is not one of those cases, but because it's such a high profile instance of an artistic genius doing that, I think it might curb other people who actually could do a lot better than Coppola did.
All right, so I'm going to give my rant. So I wanted to rant to you about the Luigi Mangione fan club or fanship that has emerged online. So you, I'm sure, know that I'm talking about the person who killed United Health CEO Brian Thompson outside of a hotel in New York on December 4th of this year. So he had some words written on the shell casings of the three shell casings that were of the bullets that were fired delay, deny, depose, was it? Or delay, deny, defend, whichever.
Yeah, deny, depose, and defend.
Deny, depose, defend. Okay. Making it clear that there was some kind of political motive. So the actual killer, Luigi Mangione, might turn out to just be a crazy person. That's often the case with assassinations. It's often the case that their ideologies are not ones that people are familiar with, or they're incoherent or something like that. And honestly, it seems like this person's best legal defense is going to be some kind of insanity defense, you know. But before he was captured or apprehended at a McDonald's in Altoona, Pennsylvania, a few days later, even before that happened, there was a kind of fanship that had emerged around this guy, speculating he was some sort of like John Wick character. But, you know, he got caught in a McDonald's with a manifesto. It's not a very James Bond-like or glorious, way to be apprehended. But nonetheless, a lot of people have been seeing this killing in a kind of gleeful way. And there are really two categories of this. There's one category of people who are straight up justifying it, straight up saying that this was a justified killing. And there are other people, and I'm just going to focus on the less extreme case, just so as not to overstate my case, who admit that this is wrong, but nonetheless have a certain glee about it, can't help but not have normal kind of sympathy that you would expect people to have for someone who has just been killed and for that person's family. So there's been a kind of, have you heard the term justice porn? Have you heard that term?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so that's
I've heard each of those individually, but I've never heard them put together.
Right. So justice porn refers to videos of like a bully is like picking on someone, and then he happens to pick on a woman who knows Taekwondo and gets his ass kicked. And it's kind of satisfying. It's like the bully got what was coming to him. But a lot of people seem to be taking this kind of, having that kind of thrill from watching the video of this, which is available online, and reading about it. And I really think it's quite depraved. I just think, and just to let you know what I'm talking about, online comments, I'm sure you've seen them, to news stories just about the family, the survivors. He's got a wife and 2 kids. People saying things like, well, they can afford therapy, or just responding with laughing emojis. I read an article shortly after this happened that said that United Health put out a statement about this guy's death that had like 82,000 comments, and 77,000 of them were laughing emojis. This is an unbelievably cold reaction. And of course, people are jerks online, but there is a poll of 1,000 people that reports astonishing levels of sympathy for this killing. So I'm reading from an Axios story. So 41% of young voters say United Healthcare CEO killing acceptable. That breaks down to 24% found it somewhat acceptable, and 17% completely acceptable. I think this is just completely appalling. And yeah, here's just for the actual justice of the action itself. Here's a quick argument for you. So either this killing is going to make a difference to these healthcare problems, or it isn't. Okay. So let's say, as some people have claimed might have happened even already, that Luigi Mangione's gunning down of Brian Thompson has actually influenced the healthcare direction, in the right direction. Companies are going to be more generous with honoring claims and this sort of thing because they're afraid of vigilante justice. Okay, if that's true, then that is also going to broadcast the message that terrorism is an effective way of seeking social change. And that will be true across many domains, not just healthcare. And of course, if there's no difference made by this action, then of course it's not justified. So this, either way, it's really bad. It's really, really bad. And I am disgusted by seeing people respond to this, of course, approvingly, but also just in ways that are equivocal. So I don't know if you saw the Daily News article, the guest post on this.
Yeah, I saw that.
Did you read it?
Yes. I didn't read every single comment. There was a huge thread from that, but I read the initial post when it came out, and I read some of the comments.
Okay. So this is on Daily News, which is probably right now the biggest philosophy blog. I had a guest post that does indeed conclude that the killing, it was wrong. And Justin Weinberg, who hosts this blog, is I kind of trying to get in front of criticisms. Like there's a note now that's posted at the top of it that says, "Note, the author of this post concludes that the killing of Brian Thompson was wrong." He says, "I've added this statement because some people sharing the post on social media are making misleading statements about that." I don't think that's true. I'm sure probably some people on social media are saying misleading things about it. But the ones I saw that Weinberg was responding to were criticizing it for being equivocal. Yes, there are some throwaway lines that come to the right moral conclusions, but the article is called Complications, which doesn't suggest that it's very clear-eyed in this. And it's more than 3,000 words of giving explanations for why it seems appropriate to feel ambiguous about this. And this is how Weinberg introduces that article. He says, "The killing of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson earlier this month has ignited moral debate around the world. Many have condemned the killing as they would any other murder. Others, though, have thought of the killing was less morally clear, and some have celebrated it." Okay, so he goes on like this, but just from that intro alone, it should be clear that we're not giving a full-throated condemnation of this. It's sort of saying, it's complicated. It's complicated. And the actual article itself, there's a lot of time spent discussing claims from a lawsuit that what United Healthcare was doing was really morally bad, and therefore what Thompson was involved in was morally bad. But I don't think any of that it really bears on the killing at all, the morality of it. The author's name, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this person's name correctly. I don't know if you know this person. Saba Bazargan Forward, I think is how you pronounce this person's name. I'm not familiar with this person.
Me either. I hadn't heard of them before I read the post.
Right. But there is a brief, after this long discussion of reasons that you might have for hating United Healthcare and the CEO, Brian Thompson, there's just this brief passage of like, well, maybe that makes him complicit in a way that makes it permissible to legitimately target him. And then at the end, the author backs away from the claim. But I think it's fairly clear from reading this post that the message wasn't that, oh, this is a terrible thing. It was like, okay, it's wrong, but you have to see that it's kind of complicated. That's the title. That is the message that's conveyed. It is a very wishy-washy post that seems designed to, I don't know, lead us to contemplate maybe this might have been justified, even though the author sort of backs away from it at the end. Anyway, that's all I'll say about that. What is your reaction?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I'm glad to be able to talk to you about this because in some ways my reaction aligns with yours. In other ways, it's very different. So one thing that frustrates me about this is the lack of complexity that a lot of people see. But let me preface my response with the point of agreement, which is I just think that this, even as a self-described consequentialist, is a heinous moral wrong. I don't want to have anything that I say afterwards about the complexity of moral issues be interpreted as not taking seriously the gravity of the situation or how deeply wrong this murder was. So I just want to state, like, unequivocally wrong, don't want to minimize it. The fitting attitude, I think, to have, especially towards his family, is sympathy. And the deontic status of murdering him was impermissible, assuming that the killer is actually a moral agent that can be responsible for his actions. So I think it's not only extremely wrong, but I share how you're disturbed by the large number of people that seem totally okay with it, or if not totally okay with it, thinking that the fitting attitudes to have towards the wrong act are positive in some way, or some sense of like elation is justified because the head of this company was killed. The quickness with which so many people seem totally okay with murder is something that I found a bit alarming, to put it mildly. I still find that alarming. But along the same lines, or, you know, what I think is necessarily intertwined with that is one of the reasons I found it so alarming is how little people seem to think through this, right? It was just a lot of like, well, the insurance companies are bad, which, depending on how you flesh that out, I actually completely agree with. And that denying essential claims of coverage for profit is wrong, which I agree with. You know, we can flesh out the details, but largely agree with that. So it's okay to kill the person that's the head of that, sort of irrespective of the consequences. That seems to be the extent of a lot of people's thought. Now, just want to also be clear, I do have to speak in generalities, and I'm not talking about everybody, and I'm not saying that no one has some well worked out view, however they come down on the issue. And if you're listening to this podcast, or you're one of the people that I know personally who's a philosopher, you're probably an exception to this general rule. So I just want to be clear, not all people condoning the murder or minimizing it in any way is somebody that's going to fall under this banner of criticism. But there's a lot of people, maybe especially from commentators online, that seem to put almost no thought into this whatsoever and are quite happy to be okay with murder without having without subsuming it under a sort of coherent normative ethical view or really trying to subject their beliefs to scrutiny. I'd be much less concerned if it were some sort of hard-hearted hedonistic act utilitarian that says, oh, you know, I did the calculation and it looks like it's going to maximize well-being overall for these reasons. And maybe it's still very sad or unfortunate that somebody who didn't deserve to die was killed. But like, that's just what utilitarianism implies about lots of cases. And this is one of those cases. Or if some committed social contract theorist said, well, he, you know, violated the social contract in some important way, in a way that he's culpably responsible for the deaths of many people as the head. And then it makes it okay. I don't agree with that. Again, and I think decisively that's wrong. But somebody who put in that much thought would concern me much less than how quickly people are to condemn it. Whereas in other contexts, they give explanations that are contradictory. So they will condemn many murders and then say things like, well, the person didn't deserve to die. Or like, murder's bad, or you could never, ever take a human life, which is obviously not true once you really think through the implications. So my reaction is actually, I don't know, it feels like I'm disagreeing with you, but I'm not actually sure the extent to which I am. But my reaction is, ethics is actually very, very hard. And I think the right thing to do is to not quickly rush to any sort of judgment about complicated cases that merit discussion, and to really think through them. And if we did that for this case, again, can't overstate this, I would think unequivocally we would come to the conclusion that this was a grossly immoral thing to do. But it would lead to surprising conclusions in a range of other cases as well. But people just don't want to do that. They want to just look at their little first order judgments and then fill in some sort of vague explanation that sounds justified to them at first glance and not subject that to scrutiny, and then just sort of haphazardly appeal to these ad hoc justifications for whatever range of cases that come, you know, into their radar throughout the years. And that actually really, really bugs me. So I'm happy that the Daily News is taking this seriously in terms of having a moral discussion about it in a way that maybe you don't seem happy about.
Yeah, I think we do mostly agree. We mostly agree. I agree. That's the most disturbing thing. What you describe is the kind of thoughtlessness, the stampeding toward this. I'm reminded, by the way, of another thing that happened a couple of years ago, which was, you remember that Titanic sub sank and, killing all the
Titanic was many years ago. That was over 100 years ago.
The sub.
I'm just kidding. I know. I'm just kidding. The Titanic sub. Yeah.
So those were a bunch of rich people who paid like $250,000 to do this thing, which, by the way, I would, for reasons we would agree on, I don't think you should spend that kind of money in that way, But nonetheless, there was just this gleefulness that these people, it turned out that they had died pretty much instantaneously, but there was a belief that they might be on the bottom of the ocean slowly running out of oxygen. And there were people who were having a countdown for how long their oxygen would last, and were having like confetti and all this stuff, like, yay. And like, people, hatred for the rich is not love for the poor. This is vile. This is ghoulish. And that is, I think, the thing I'm reacting against most strongly. However, I don't agree with you that this is an appropriate thing to discuss as a complicated moral issue, unless we're going to take every terrorist act and subject it to this sort of, what can be said? I mean, after all, Timothy McVeigh had very good reasons to be angry at the U.S. federal government. The person who murdered British MP Joe Cox had a pretty good point about immigration. Let's think. I just think there's something wrong about publicly doing this, treating a murder case, a straightforward, ethically clear murder case, as if it were one of these hard cases in bioethics where there's like a living will, but it's not exactly clear. You've got autonomy considerations, you've got well-being considerations, and all this stuff. I just think there's something despicable and something that erodes the public fabric to treat something obviously morally wrong as debatable, especially if your arguments are just shit, as is the case with this Daily News post. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so let me ask you about this. This is really interesting. So one thing that I want to say, which I think Justin Weinberg said on that thread, is that this is something that's garnered a lot of like public debate. And I think that's actually a sufficient reason to have ethicists weigh in, even if it turns out for various cases that the weighing in is decisively on one end. One reason to do that is to try to maybe make some headway, even if it's small, in getting the public to think more clearly about an issue. So if the Daily News existed when Timothy McVeigh committed his act of terrorism, and there were in fact a bunch of people celebrating it on social media, I think, well, maybe this is something we should get ethicists to come and weigh in on. As to whether it's complicated for this case, I think in one sense, no, because as I mentioned and want to stress again, I just think decisively morally wrong. But there's another sense in which I think all ethical matters are complicated because they have to be subsumed under the correct normative ethical view. And of course, there's complicated questions about metaethics, which as you've written on. And salient things like this, where people are talking about it and want to talk about it, might be an opportune time to get them to try to subject their beliefs to scrutiny when they're offering often very terrible reasons to justify things that seem morally heinous, that are in, if not straight out contradiction, in deep tension with other commitments that they hold. I think facilitating the sort of discussion around that can be a way, perhaps, to get them to start to think more clearly and weed out contradictory or false beliefs, or maybe become a little more epistemically humble about their moral views. Maybe that's naive on my part, but that at least seems like a viable possibility to me, and would be one reason to discuss cases of even very extreme and you might think often very clear wrongdoing.
I agree that can happen, but I think the manner of weighing in that would be responsible in this case is weighing in to debunk rationalizations. and not to take them so seriously and give everyone the impression that an ambiguous set of attitudes is possibly the correct one. And it even ends with an open-ended, there are many things in this article that suggest in a nearby possible world, or in the actual world, if government reform doesn't happen quickly enough, that such things might be justified. Like, we may yet get to the point where it becomes clear that the government will never be willing or able to regulate these industries in the ways that morality requires and that the people demand. And that, of course, was the justification that was ultimately given for why the killing was not acceptable, is that this person, Luigi Mangione, wasn't an authority, the government's the authority. But it ends with, oh, well, if the government doesn't do its thing. So look, I'm not saying don't debate it, don't reason about it. I want to be clear, nothing is beyond reason, nothing is beyond thinking about. But there is a way to do it that is irresponsible, and that's when you take something really evil and say, let's contextualize this. Let's bend over backwards to make bogus rationalizations seem like they're actually good arguments, and then maybe have a cover your ass line at the end. Oh, but of course I'm saying it's wrong. Of course I'm saying it's wrong. I don't think that's a responsible form of engagement.
Yeah. So let me ask, are there variations in other possible worlds where you think it would be more complicated? So suppose that there were really clear evidence that assassinating him would result in insurance not saying hiring more security for the CEOs or trying to anonymize who the CEOs are, then raising costs as a result, but really just ceasing to deny as many claims as possible when it's going to maximize profitability. Or I think United Healthcare was accused of denying claims that they knew were legitimate because it'd be less costly to deal with those that took it to court than to honor the contract, right? So suppose actually killing a CEO of a healthcare company resulted in the end to that, whereas no other nonviolent means, let's suppose, or less harmful means would result in that. And the amount of lives that would be saved and the welfare that would be produced would be clearly maximum. Would that seem like more complicated, less unambiguous issue to deal with in your mind? Were that true, hypothetically?
Well, I don't think we could actually be in the position to know that something like that is going to have overall good effects because of the tertiary effects of this, of the signal that if indeed, as I said, is one lemma of my argument, if this ends up getting favorable results in the healthcare case, people will get the message that this is the way to achieve positive change. You murder the people who have bad policies. You murder politicians of the parties you don't like. You murder people who are members of left-wing NGOs who are culpable in some broad sense in order to, I just think that the consequentialist argument isn't plausible if you think 3-4 steps ahead.
Yeah, that might be right. I mean, that was an oversimplified version for the purposes of a thought experiment. It wasn't saying that was the case here. But, once we get answers about that case, then we can build in additional real world complications to think about what the different options are and maximizing expected value over time. And that would require looking at things like how likely are there to be copycats, and how many would they be, and how likely are they to be successful. And so, I grant all that, but I guess the broader question that I had is, you want to say that this is just so clearly wrong as to not, that the way that it's been discussed among philosophers is, I guess, morally wrong or objectionable way to discuss it. I want to know, are there variations? Like if the facts were different, in some slightly different way, would that merit a more nuanced discussion in your mind? Or do you just think there's not even anything close to what actually happened that would merit this sort of nuanced discussion that a lot of people in academia are having?
I don't want to say there's no possible case that would merit it. I doubt there's one with minor modifications. I do think that the way we talk about atrocities matters, and I do think that responding to them with an impulse to provide context or to provide rationalization, particularly if it's not thought out rationalizations, is something that I think is particularly in the immediate aftermath of an event where the worry about copycats and this kind of thing is fresh. I think that's an irresponsible thing to do, but I suppose I'll grant you, I'm not willing to say that there's no kind of case that I would say, well, it's debatable in this way. I mean, there were revenge killings for the Armenian genocide that I think, well, I can kind of understand that. Things like that. So I don't want to take an absolutist line, but I just think that, given the contingent facts we know, I think this one is so far beyond the pale that this kind of hemming and hawing about it is irresponsible.
Yeah, I guess the last thing I'll say is, I mean, I hear that, but I am very open to subjecting any sort of claim to scrutiny, even if we expect the result to be a firmer confidence from our starting point. And I am generally cautious, not that this is inconsistent with what you said, but I'm generally cautious about shutting down debate, because other things that people will take as like clearly decisively wrong or obviously the right thing to do, then they might try to shut down debate about those issues when they're in fact they're the ones that are wrong, and this is actually much more complicated than they thought. So I lean very, very heavily, not that you're trying to shut down debate, but I lean very, very heavily towards just sort of welcoming serious, nuanced discussion about anything, no matter how black and white it might seem at first glance. I'm sure there's exceptions to that. I'd have to think through examples. I'm not sure where I'd want to come down on various issues, but antecedently, I lean very far in that direction.
Okay, yeah. In principle, I agree with what you're saying. Provided it genuinely is. But I guess I would just say it has to if it's something like this, there is an added burden to really be giving clear thinking about it. And I think there's an added irresponsibility of muddled thinking when we're talking about something like this. And that's all.
Great. I guess this is solved.
All right. It looks like we're recording. So I have no idea what you're going to rant about. Ben Burgis, what do you got for me?
I'm going to rant about Palestine and my reaction, my frustration with a lot of people's reactions to it. And in a way, this is actually a little while ago, we were talking about, having you on my show, and we were talking about different things. And this is sort of, in a lot of ways, this is the sort of rant version of what I'd originally pitched. And this morning, I've been I don't know, the last couple of days I've mostly been grading and working on other things. But this morning I was like, okay, I'm going to wake up and figure out something and get together some notes about it so I could do this, because I've been promising to for a while, and I was going to do something else. And then I was like, yeah, you know what? This is actually what I'm most frustrated about. I've been asked to rant, it's an unusual invitation, so hell with it. I'll rant about this.
All right, you may proceed.
All right. Well, I haven't, as I said, gotten that odd invitation to rant. I spent a while thinking about this. And one of the things that I've found the very most maddening in the last year has been the reaction of so many heterodox types to the atrocities in Gaza. And I promise this is going to get more ranty in just a moment, but I want to start by making it as clear as I can, both who I'm talking about and where I'm coming from in terms of larger positioning. So at a very rough approximation, when I say heterodox types, I mean people who aren't conservatives, but in the last several years have positioned themselves against dissidents against prevailing liberal orthodoxies, people who may even in many cases vote for Democrats or would if they lived in the United States. Some of them live other places, but who have certainly become enemies of normie libs to one extent or another, often because of concerns about free speech or identity politics. That, and I really want to emphasize this point, this is the half about where I'm coming from, are concerns I actually find pretty reasonable. Hell, my starting point, is clearly much further left, but I've raised a lot of very similar concerns. Check out the critical review that I wrote for Damage of Naomi Klein's book Doppelganger. The review is called Left Identitarianism is Also a Mere World. Hell, I wrote a book that came out 3 years ago called Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, and I went on Joe fucking Rogan to talk about it. So in a certain sense, I'm at least pretty adjacent to the concerns that people I'm talking about. And at the very least, whether I always agree with them or not, or even if I sometimes think they fall into silly culture war traps of their own, I really do share some of their basic impulses. Cancel culture is toxic. Identity politics is bad. Shutting down important debates with spurious accusations of bigotry is certainly bad. We should be even-handed universalists about whatever principles we care about and not listen to some people more and blah, 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 all that stuff. Well, hold that thought, because we're a little over a year into the easiest possible test of all of the above in recent history. And so many of these people are failing it. So many. A lot of these people are Americans. All of them talk about American politics. And somehow a lot of them seem to be totally fine, 5 by 5, with the United States giving endless money and weapons to an apartheid ethno-state that's carrying out one of the best documented campaigns of ethnic cleansing in human history against its internal non-citizen population, right in the goddamn light of day, complete with Israeli soldiers posting TikToks every 5 minutes of themselves rifling through the lingerie drawers of Palestinian women they forced to leave their homes at gunpoint or playing with the children's toys. Every principle these people have ever claimed to care about in any other context, every one of them points in the opposite direction. But some of them have always made a giant exception for this one country, this one situation, and a lot of them have just kind of let themselves be negatively polarized by their dislike of the left into poo-pooing the people protesting to stop the atrocities. You have a critique of identity politics? That critique is strong enough to get you to spend a lot of time and energy criticizing the relatively trivial identitarian irritations of the American culture war? Well, how in God's name is it not strong enough to make you an anti-Zionist? How is Zionism not one of the most dangerous and muscular forms of identity-based extremism on God's green earth in the 2020s? Certainly out of the forms of identitarian extremism that have any kind of mainstream purchase in the Western world in the third decade of the 21st century, Zionism has got to top the list. This is an ideology that says it's not only fine for a nation state to be the state of a particular ethnic subset of its citizens, and indeed people of that ethnicity from all over the world, rather than a state of everybody who lives in that country, which is something that anyone with the slightest, tiniest instinct for liberal universalism would rightly find abhorrent in literally any other context. They don't just say that. They say Israel's right to be an ethno-state is so important. It justifies massive systematic violations of what in literally any other context we would all agree are mind-numbingly basic rights. We're talking about millions of people whose families were ethnically cleansed within living memory, not being allowed to come back because openly and unabashedly, they'll tell you this is the reason letting them come back would change the ethnic balance of the state. There'd be too many people with the wrong ethnicity compared to the people with the right ethnicity. Having a criticism of identity politics in American culture war politics, but not having a problem with that is like saying you can't drink a cup of Maxwell House because the caffeine makes you too jittery and it's bad for you. And then every 5 minutes sneaking into the bathroom to hoover up a gigantic line of Coke. We're talking about a state that's incorporated territory into its borders for the last 57 years and built entire cities of its own citizens in that territory, but has never once offered citizenship to the millions of people who were born in that territory for one reason and one reason only. One that every politician in the country's Zionist mainstream has been crystal clear about forever. They have zero shame about it, which is that letting these millions of people have citizenship would change the ethnic balance of the state. And oh, by the way, apologists love to say these weird, vapid talking points like, oh, how can you say it's apartheid when Arabs who are born on the Israeli side of the Green Line have citizenship rights? They can be doctors or lawyers or even elected to the Knesset. But I really think anyone capable of rubbing two thoughts together for warmth should be able to see through that one pretty quickly. First, even if the so-called Israeli Arabs, i.e. Palestinians whose families ended up on the right side of the line after the initial ethnic cleansing in 1948, really had all the rights of Jewish citizens, it would be a total non sequitur. Millions of people in territory that Israelis have incorporated into their country for every other purpose, territory that they unabashedly say every 5 minutes they will never under any circumstances consider giving up, millions of people being denied citizenship because of their ethnicity is more than sufficient for the word apartheid to fit. It wouldn't follow from Israeli Arabs not being denied citizenship for being Arab that no one is denied citizenship for being Arab, especially because, again, no mainstream Israeli politician has ever been shy about saying we can't give these West Bank Arabs equal rights because if we did, there would be too many Arab citizens and we wouldn't have a guarantee of a permanent Jewish majority forever. And also, read any human rights organization's report on this stuff, and they'll tell you that the idea that Israeli Arabs have equal rights is a total absurdity. The kind of blatant, open, no Arabs allowed in this housing development discrimination that's banned by the Civil Rights Act in the United States, has been banned since decades before I was born, is totally illegal and openly practiced there. Racist harassment by authorities is totally routine. Zero of those Arab Knesset members who Western apologists like to treat as props for their no apartheid here talking points, zero of the actual Arab Knesset members would tell you that there's no apartheid in Israel. Oh, and by the way, Arab candidates for the Knesset are routinely legally disqualified from running for being too anti-Zionist and too openly saying we should just be a state of everyone who lives there and not a specifically Jewish state. And sure, if you ignored all this and put your hands to your eyes like the see no evil monkey and told yourself that Israeli Arabs had equality, you could tell yourself, past tense, in the 90s and 2000s, that the millions of Arabs denied citizenship in the West Bank were fine, no apartheid here, because one day there would be a two-state solution. But now, Benjamin Netanyahu says every 5 minutes that there will never, under any circumstances, be a two-state solution. And it's not just him. Even the mainstream opposition is on that page. The Knesset passed a resolution saying there would never, ever be a two-state solution, and the only Jewish Knesset member to vote against it was a member of the Communist Party. Everybody else either skipped the vote so they wouldn't have to go on record one way or the other, or voted yes. So where does that leave them? If there's never, ever going to be a two-state solution, and they're never, ever going to give these millions of human beings citizenship in their state, where does that leave them? The logic of the situation is the logic of ethnic cleansing. And when Hamas committed some very bad, but compared to what happened next, microscopic war crimes of their own on October 7th of last year, and gave Israel the golden excuse that they were looking for, that's exactly the logic they've been acting on ever since. In a war allegedly being fought to root out 30,000 Hamas fighters, that's the estimated pre-October 7th number. And oh boy, if you believe that that's really what the war is being fought for, I have many thousands of bombed out bridges to sell you. In that war, Israel has forced literally millions of people to evacuate from their homes at gunpoint, just openly Milosevician. And when civilians have evacuated to exactly where they're told to evacuate to, 2,000-pound bombs are dropped on them there. Israel has systematically and blatantly and methodically destroyed every aspect of normal civilian infrastructure, and no one who hasn't just turned their brain off on this subject can continue to believe it's collateral damage, that it's unintentional. It just doesn't, story just does not fit the most evident facts of the case. And meanwhile, there's been a flood of nonstop, openly genocidal rhetoric, just Rwanda-level rhetoric from members of the ruling party of the Knesset, from important cultural and political figures, from members of Netanyahu's cabinet. South Africa's genocide filing at the International Court of Justice has 12 straight pages of just some of the highlights of this stuff. Every single otherwise respected international human rights organization has said Israel's actions in Gaza, and a lot of similar stuff in the West Bank too, by the way, without even the Hamas excuse in many cases, that Israel's actions have been genocidal in intent. That's what they all say. That the goal is to kill so many civilians that the remainder are terrified for their lives, to make normal life totally impossible, to induce the rest, or as many of the rest as they can, to accept quote unquote voluntary resettlement out of the country. And you can tell yourself, if you really want to believe fairy tales, that every single human rights organization is just wrong about this because they have anti-Semitic bias against Israel. But hold on. Speaking of those heterodox types, we started out talking about, isn't this what the most degrading kind of identitarians do? Accuse everyone who takes the wrong side of a debate of being motivated by secret bigotry? Oh, and aren't we supposed to be concerned about campus snowflakes and safetyism? Well, the most severe outbreak of spurious accusations of bigotry and campus safetyism in our lifetimes has been playing out over the course of the last year over this. And so many heterodox types have let themselves be negatively polarized into being at best indifferent to it. Because sure, leftists they dislike are going to take the standard pro-Palestinian leftist position. And sure, they'll do all sorts of usual standard annoying leftist things when they explain their position. They'll engage in all sorts of silly rhetoric, etc. So it's easy for heterodox types who want to focus on all that to just focus on all that and ignore the identitarian, safetyist, censorious elephant in the room. As there are flat out McCarthyite congressional hearings devoted to demonizing anyone who dissents against this balls out identitarian extremist movement as being a bigot and pretending to be oh so concerned about the safety of Jewish students because of protests to stop US support for an ethnic apartheid state, expelling its internal non-citizen population and indiscriminately killing them. Never mind that anyone with even a moment's passing knowledge of the Palestinian solidarity movement, or frankly, the American left in general, could tell you with absolute rock solid confidence that a hugely disproportionate number of these protesters are themselves Jewish, because of course they are. The left in general has always been hugely disproportionately Jewish, as right-wing anti-Semites never tire of pointing out. And in particular, the people on the left most likely to be focused on this issue because they've struggled within their own lives or fought with their own families about it are Jewish, fucking obviously. Yet we have flagship heterodox journal, The Free Press, devoting itself 24/7 to running cover for the identitarian ideology in question and 24/7 demonizing anyone who dissents from it and spuriously accusing them of bigotry and certainly ignoring the nonstop flood of free speech issues over this question since 10/7. And we even have podcasts I won't name any names on that, spending way more time zeroing in on the excesses of the protesters than what should be their bread and butter, the Zionist elephant in the room of censoriousness and identity politics. We have heterodox lib types. I don't know, Iona Italia, I think, has done this, right? The former editor of Ario, putting Israeli flags in their Twitter bios, which would frankly be the close equivalent of, if Twitter had existed in 1999, putting the Serbian flag in your Twitter bio then. And frankly, I don't want to hear from any of these people about free speech or identity politics in any other context after this.
All right. Wow. There's really a lot there. It works as kind of a response to maybe unintentional to Mark Oppenheimer's rant on last year's Rant-a-thon. This year he's ranting about something different. I feel like we could go back about this for like a couple of hours, but I'll just ask one question. And I guess it's about something you said at the beginning. Do you take the position that basing a state on ethnic lines is always bad for universalistic reasons, right? Like is Kurdish nationalism wrong for universalist reasons? Okay, yeah, I'll just ask that.
Sure. Yeah, I think ethnic nationalism is wrong for universalist reasons, right? I think most really existing nationalisms are somewhere on a spectrum from pure ethno-nationalism to pure civic nationalism, right? That the sort of pure civic nationalist claim would be that, that the nation is just constituted by everybody who happens to be in these borders, or everybody who's willing to come over and accept the American way of life, maybe, right? People say things like this, right? The pure ethno-nationalist position is, well, this is just like the ancestral Volk, right? And that's what counts. And again, I think most actually existing nationalisms are somewhere on a spectrum between those two. But I think the further they are onto ethnic nationalism, the worse that is, right? Just in terms of the sort of standard, universalist ideas about this that should very much tilt you towards, if we're going to do nationalism, let's make it civic nationalism. And then I think, I get more disturbed on universalist grounds the more the sort of ethnic imperative is taken to justify, right? Like in other words, if you have, you just kind of happen to land in relatively homogenous circumstances, and you have this, ethnic ideology bound up with your conception of the nation. I don't love that to start with. But if the only thing that it leads you to do is to like maybe have really discriminatory immigration laws, right? I don't, that itself I don't love, right? I definitely have issues with that, right? But I think that there's also like that's, if you think, okay, let's have discriminatory immigration laws to make sure, that we don't have too many people who aren't in the right ethnic group who are part of the nation, then I'm already uncomfortable with that. But, I also think that everything that I talked about is much, much, much more extreme than that, right? And than just having discriminatory laws about which brand new immigrants can show up. And so that all indicates to me a position that's like way further in the wrong end of the spectrum, even than that.
All right, Ben, we'll leave it at that for now. I look forward to our future podcast collaborations where we'll pick this up in more detail. And I'm grateful for you adding to the intellectual diversity of the Rant-a-thon this year.
All right, fair enough. Thanks, Spencer.